How excited we are to have with us today Shane Claiborne. Shane is a person that's sort of hard to describe in many ways. But I think the best way to describe Shane is that he is an ordinary radical. He's ordinary in the sense that he, as you're going to discover in just a few moments, he's one of the most down-to-earth people, one of the most fun and funny people that you'll ever meet. And yet, he's also a radical in the best sense of the word, that he does his very best in his life to live what that word really means, which is to get to the root of things, to get to the heart of things, to live out in the most authentic way that he has been able to figure out in his life with God, and also now with his new wife, Katie, what it means to live a life in service and love and witness to Jesus. And he does so not merely as a philosopher. He does so as a practitioner, as the founder of The Simple Way, a community in North Philadelphia, of believers who come together to live together, to serve each other, and to be about the work of charity and justice, transforming neighborhoods and lives of people, not only in North Philadelphia, but frankly through his witness around the world. So it is an incredible joy to welcome today Shane Claiborne. Please join us with this one.
I am just delighted to be here. I found out we were a couple minutes late, so sorry about that. That's okay when you're with the Pentecostals, not as cool when you're with the Episcopalians. But I'm delighted, to be here with my wife of 7 months, Katie Jo. She's from Cornelius, so we got some family here, and it's fun to be home. We came from Philly, though. I didn't grow up there. In fact, one of my friends was telling me about the first time he got mugged in Philly. And he said, it was real interesting, though. The guy came up and asked for his money, and so my buddy, threw his wallet at him, kind of took off, and the guy was like, whoa, 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 I just want your money. You can have your license and credit cards back. This is the city of love, man. And so it's a wild place, but it's won our hearts. And someone asked last night, how did you choose Philadelphia? And I said, I feel more like it kind of chose us, because I was a student right outside of Philly in 1995 and literally was reading the newspaper, and we read the headline article, which was about a group of homeless families, mostly moms and kids, that had moved into an abandoned Catholic church building. And they had started living there really out of desperation. Our neighborhood has tons of abandoned buildings, abandoned factories, and so they found this old church and said, hey, we ought to be able to stay here. But what happened was really heartbreaking. The Catholic Archdiocese gave them a 48-hour eviction notice and said if you're not out in 2 days, you could be arrested for trespassing on church property. I don't know about you, but that didn't feel quite right, So the families were amazing organizers. They hung a banner on the front of the building that said, how can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? And I think it was really in that place that I began to understand what it means to be Christian, what it means to be born again in the truest sense. I mean, growing up in East Tennessee, I got born again. In fact, I got born again like every summer we'd get born again, and but there came a point, where we had come to the altar singing just as I am and leave just as we were and kept living just like we always had. And you sort of start to go, there's got to be more to being a Christian than just, coming to altar calls. And so we began to wrestle with what it would really look like if we took the words of Jesus seriously, in light of the world that we live in. Wrestle with what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves in a world where we've got neighbors that are in cardboard boxes, and so those things kind of started keeping us up at night. And we moved into the neighborhood and really inspired by the early church in the book of Acts, where it says that they met in each other's homes. No one claimed any of their possessions were their own. They shared stuff with each other, and the church was lived out of living rooms and dinner tables, and that's kind of what caught our attention. And so now we've, for the past 10 years, we've kind of been building a little village together where we've got, about a dozen houses and properties where many of them were abandoned that we've brought back to life, and we're trying to live in that spirit of the early church and pray and serve and work together. And it's out of that context that all of the big questions of justice come and things like that. I didn't, start out in this to be a social activist or anything. We just fell in love with neighbors, and we saw a 5-year-old kid die because they didn't have adequate health care, and these things. So those things kind of continue to stir up, but they're always new, and they're always rooted in our love for Jesus and for our neighbors, and the same questions that you all are trying to figure out right here in Charlotte. So it's really exciting for us to be a part of the conversation this morning. And I was told early on that this is not a monologue but a dialogue. So I'm really excited to talk with Chip, and then I think we're going to open it up to the larger group. I said, is this a Episcopal service? Because I'm used to Episcopal services, and they're like, no, this is Sunday school. And I was like, wow, this is the biggest Sunday school class I've done in a while, and so, but I'm really excited, not just about giving a homily, but actually about having a conversation, because I think it's such an exciting time to be alive today, where folks are asking real questions about the world that we live in, and the gospel has everything to say about that world. I love how Karl Barth said, we've got to read the Bible in one hand, but we've got to read the newspaper in the other, and wrestle with how our faith affects the world that we live in. And our faith is not just a ticket into heaven and a license to ignore the world around us. So it's great to be here with you, and I look forward to the conversation. Is this when we move up here? Yeah, great. Okay.
There's a lot of talk these days about what it means to be a Christian, and the word Christian has it's become a bad word in a lot of circles, and some people have sort of gotten rid of the word altogether and talked about themselves as Jesus followers. What has your perspective been on? What is your perspective right now of sort of what's happening in the Christian church and what's emerging, and what are the signs of hope that you see?
It's a huge question, and a few years ago, the Barna Research Group, sort of the Gallup of Christianity, went to every state in the U.S., and they asked young non-Christians, what are your perceptions of Christians? And I don't know if you've seen this study, but what it was released in a book called Unchristian, because what it showed is how unchristian many of the Christians have become, And so the top 3 answer from what young non-Christians said when they thought of the word Christian is, number 1, anti-gay, anti-homosexual was the number 1 answer. Number 2, Christians are judgmental. And number 3, Christians are hypocrites. And I'll stop there because the list doesn't get much better. We're prudish, we're boring. Like, the things that people thought of are really, really heartbreaking. So I think it's important to start there, because I'm pretty sure those aren't the first things folks thought of when they met Jesus, right? Oh my gosh, he's so anti-gay, or like, but I think it's exactly the opposite. So, Gandhi, it was funny, at one point he was asked if he was a Christian, and he said, oh, I love Jesus. I just wish the Christians took him more seriously, because so often they look unlike their Christ. And that's where I think that whatever language we use, I think it's important that Christians were called Christians because they were little Christ. They were little Christs. They reminded the world of Jesus, and that's what we're meant to be. So I think that there's a hunger today for a Christianity that looks like Jesus again, and that reminds the world of Jesus by our words, but also maybe even more so by our lives, by the way that we live in the world. And that's what caught the attention of the early, Romans and of their society around them, was how these Christians loved each other. And people couldn't figure it out, kind of larger society was confused sometimes. They called them incestors because they called each other brother and sister indiscriminately, and Tertullian shot back, oh, no, we share everything in common except for our husbands and wives, and so but that love that knew no boundaries was what marked the early Christians, and I think that's what people are hungry for again. But part of what's happened is we've had folks hijack the headlines with hatred, folks that blow up abortion clinics and hold signs that say God hates fags, that burn the Quran. So that's what some people have seen in the name of Christianity. And yet I think that that should break all of our hearts, because those things don't look much like Jesus. But in the end, I think there's something new stirring, and I really believe that a generation from now, when people hear the word Christian, they won't first think anti-gay, judgmental, and hypocritical, but they're going to think things like justice, reconciliation, peace, and love, joy, the fruits of the Spirit. So I guess our prayer is that the things that God is would rub off on us a little bit more.
I'm struck how your journey has taken you from a sort of an obsession with orthodoxy, with right beliefs, which is one way to think about the Christian journey, that it's all about getting our beliefs straight. And as time goes by, while you continue to think about the issues of theology, about what's right and wrong, your life has seemed to turn around the issue of orthopraxy, about how do we practice our faith. And I know that Mother Teresa had a big impact on your life. Can you tell us about your experience of that turning point and how you met Mother Teresa?
Chip, you've got such great questions. I think that one of our really the root of part of the problem in the church when it comes to how do you come out with a Christianity that is so ugly, is that we've lost the art of spiritual formation. And we've been so driven to evangelism and that it's come sometimes at the cost of discipleship, because people become believers, but they don't follow necessarily, and I saw that in my own life. Like, I was a believer in Jesus long before I decided to follow Jesus. And I started to see that you can believe in the bodily resurrection, that Jesus died for our sins and still live however we want, if those things don't become realized in our life. And Jesus' commission wasn't to go into the world and make believers, but to make disciples, to form people into folks that live differently in the world. So one of my friends who's Catholic, he's like, well, he's pretty humble, but he said, Catholics, that's what we're about, is forming people into more than just one-time commitment, but into a lifestyle of commitment. And he said, you all have focused on the teachings and the doctrines in the evangelical church, and we've kind of focused on the ethics and the life of the Christian, and we talked a little more, and he said, I said, what's the difference? He said, the difference is you guys come out with good televangelists, and we come out with Mother Teresa's. And I pushed back a little bit, but the fact is, not all of your priests have been that good. But anyway, but but the fact is that there's something to this, that we don't have to throw them out. Like, I think that part of what the knee-jerk reaction to that is just, we don't need those doctrines. And I think that the core beliefs of our faith are really, really important. But in the end, those beliefs should lead us to action, and the final judgment according to Jesus in Matthew 25 is not a doctrinal test. It's not just that God's going to go, okay, creation, was that 7 days literal? Or virgin birth, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? But in Matthew 25, Jesus says, we're going to be asked, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was in prison, did you visit me? When I was a stranger, did you welcome me in? That the real test of our faith is how it works itself out in compassion and love. And that's what I love about Mother Teresa. One of her great lines was that our best sermon is our life. And she actually didn't have a whole lot of words and books to write and all that. She lived a simple life that radiated God's love and fascinated the world. And I heard one theologian say that the gospel spreads best, not through force, but through fascination. And I think folks like Mother Teresa have been that. Mother Teresa was known as a champion for life, not just because she picketed abortion clinics and wore shirts that say, abortion is murder, but because she welcomed families that were struggling, teenage moms, little kids that didn't have anyone to love them, and that's why everyone called her mother. I spent some time in India, and everybody called her mother because she was their mother. I met kids that were raised by her, and that's why they called her mom. And so I think that raises a question for all of us, that our faith has to go deeper than our ideologies and our doctrines. It's not just enough to be pro-life. If we're really pro-life, then we should have some foster kids and some teenage mothers in our lives to show for our love.
So how did you meet her? Tell that story.
Bumped into her at the shopping mall. Weirdest thing.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. When it came to really looking around and going, who's someone that's really doing this thing, that's trying to live the gospel out today, we really were continually fascinated by Mother Teresa, and she was still alive at the time, so we were young and idealistic and didn't know better, so we just wrote her a letter and said, do you give internships? Dear Mother Teresa, we want to work with you. And we didn't hear back. I guess she got a lot of mail. And so finally I just started calling some nuns on the phone and trying to get her number, and it's funny because some of them thought I was a prank caller, but one of them actually gave me a number for India, and so I called it, and I'm thinking, I'll get a polite greeting on the other line like, Missionaries of Charity, how can we help you, or something like that, and I just hear this raspy old voice answer the phone and say, hello! And I'm thinking I got the wrong number, and it was $4 a minute. This is before Skype. Not that she would have used Skype, but anyway, and I start, saying, well, we're looking to get a hold of Mother Teresa or the Missionaries of Charity or someone that the, sister's there. Can you help me? And she says, this is the Missionaries of Charity. This is Mother Teresa. Yeah, and I'm like, and I'm the Pope, and we asked her if we could come work, and she said, come on out, and we, a group of my college friends and I did, and we've been, kind of going back on and off ever since, and that work has inspired us. And one of the things that Mother Teresa used to say is that we can do no great things, but only small things with great love. It's not how much you do, but how much love you put into every act. And so the charism and love of the sisters in Calcutta has very much infected us and the work that we do in Philly.
And one of her favorite lines, of course, was "Find your Calcutta." Mm-hmm. And you have found your Calcutta in a sense with the Simple Way. Tell us about the Simple Way. What is it? What do you do? What goes on there?
Well, like I said, we ended up just moving into one row house. I guess it's important that our neighborhood is kind of amid the industrial wreckage of our like we have lost over 150,000 jobs. We've got 700 abandoned factories, and so we live in a neighborhood that is poised for resurrection. So we're trying to, from the very beginning, just move in and join what the Spirit's doing in that neighborhood. And we've learned community as much as been bringers of community. A few years ago, a fire started in one of those abandoned factories, and it burnt down one of our blocks, including the house that I lived in at the time. And so the Red Cross set up a shelter because 100 families were displaced by the fire. But then what was amazing was the Red Cross said nobody ended up sleeping in the shelter because everybody in your neighborhood opened their homes to each other. I mean, these are people that don't even have a lot of room in their homes. But in many ways, we've been just amazed by the gift of our neighborhood, even though it's one of the most economically devastated neighborhoods. It's community rich, and it's a place where we're proud to be and to live. And so we've been we've been getting houses for the last 10 years to fix up. Some of them you can get we got one house for $1. So not a bad deal, and fixed it up. If you got $1, you're looking for real estate, come on up. But we've brought some of those back to life. We help kids with homework. We open our homes to folks, and we really just try to live love and hospitality out of our homes. And we've got some community gardens now, and we have ways that those new questions have changed over the years. I mean, we've seen kids grow up now for 10 years, so you start to go, maybe we need to figure out some ways a few kids can go to college. So we hit up Eastern University, my old school, and said, hey, will you create a full ride scholarship every year for a kid in our neighborhood? So they did. So now we have our first 3 Simple Way scholars that are on full ride, full tuition scholarships, and there's all those building blocks that are there, and there's new things that come up, like we've got an incredible amount of gun violence in Philadelphia, nearly 1 homicide a day. And so, we're trying to teach kids nonviolence, rooted in Jesus' message and love. But then eventually you also start to go, where are the guns coming from? And we've seen that there's a few really irresponsible gun shops that are funneling, kind of channeling guns onto the street. And so we've began to have prayer vigils outside of the gun shops. And some of those are really powerful. Like on Good Friday, we had a Good Friday service that connected the passion of Christ to the suffering of our streets. And it was an incredible service. So we've been trying to bring attention to the roots of the injustice at the same time that we, pick up kids when they get hurt, or, walk alongside families that are struggling.
I'm struck that, you went about this without a business plan. You really sort of moved into this neighborhood.
What's a business? No.
Yeah, exactly. And you call your community a community of conspirators. And I'm struck by that word. That word is such a pejorative word, but it means to be conspiratus, to be with the Spirit. Mm-hmm. And it seems like that's a mode which is very un-Episcopalian, to think about what does it mean to not go in with a plan, to not be in control, but to be open to see what the Spirit is doing, and to vest one's life fully.
I look at the gospel, and the gospel doesn't seem like Jesus is always that strategic, like in his 5-year plan. I mean, half of the gospels are actually like interruptions and surprises. Jesus is going along, and folks are like, hey, we ran out of wine at our wedding, I mean, his first miracle is turning water into wine to keep a party going, and I think like a good joke for Episcopalians, not as good for Baptists, but anyway, but I think like over and over, Jesus is just attentive, to the folks that are pulling on his shirt, that their kid's sick, and so a lot of that is what we did. We just showed up, and we try to see where we can be available. And it's the same, kind of thing here. I think the interesting thing is, like, we actually kind of block out of our lives the very space that Jesus lived in, which was these interruptions. I mean, our lives are so routine, and that we know what's happening from hour to hour. So I think there's something to learn from that. And on the same lines, I think that the early church began to quickly be organized, but what they began to organize around, one of the first structures put in place was to make sure that the widows are taken care of well. So I think there is a place for order, and I'm really grateful I'm like an administrative yard sale, as you can imagine. But like, the gift of community is folks have different gifts, and we're all using them towards the same end of seeing God's kingdom come, and a lot of times I like to say that nonconformity to the patterns of the world doesn't mean uniformity. It doesn't all mean that we're going to look or become exactly the same, but we're transformed by Jesus, which means that we redefine who we are and how we use our gifts. And so even 2 tax collectors in the gospel, one of them, Matthew, he kind of sells everything and follows Jesus, but Zacchaeus doesn't. He sells half of everything, so it does radically affect his economics, but he then starts paying people back 4 times what he owed them, so he's like throwing a monkey wrench in the tax collecting system, but he's a different kind of tax collector. And I think that's the real question, is not, especially for young folks, is not just are you going to be a doctor or a lawyer, but what kind of doctor or lawyer are you going to be, and how do we use our gifts and our passions towards the things that are at the heart of God's kingdom.
I'm curious about how you find the courage to do what you do. I mean, many of us have great hearts and we want to make a difference in the world, but we see all the problems and it's sort of overwhelming. And you spoke last night about the role that community has played in your life. Where do you find this spirituality, this energy to do what you do, and the courage to do what you do?
From my wife, Katie.
Very good. That was a really smart move. I have to say that was really.
I do think that actually there is something to the fact that this gospel is about community and it's about partnership. It's about when Jesus says, where 2 or 3 of you gather in my name, I'm with you. So that we do get courage from being around people with courage, and by coming alongside of folks that are a few steps deeper in the journey than we are, and they kind of pull us into it, And so, I mean, every part of our life, from getting involved in the cathedral takeover, to going to India, to being in Iraq, all these things that we've been a part of they've been communal experiences. And so we're kind of creating a different kind of inertia, to where it makes sense to be closer to suffering rather than away from it, and everything in our world is pulling us another direction, to move away from neighborhoods where there's high crime or there's people that don't look like us or whatever it is. And yet, it takes community to create an inertia that is pushing us towards the upside down kingdom, of God, where the last are first, the first are last, where we're really moving ourselves closer to those things. So, that's where I think some of it comes, and it comes from Jesus. It comes from one of my old Catholic friends. He was asked, how do you sustain this, life of activism and service? And he said, every morning, I crawl up into a little ball, and I hear Jesus whisper to me how much he loves me. Mm-hmm. And that gives me the courage to do it another day. So I think that there's certainly a part of this whole journey that is not just about, being driven all the time to do stuff, but to listen to the whisper that we're loved, and then to become that whisper to the world and to folks, especially maybe that have really not felt loved very much. And so, having a real vital life of prayer. We pray together every single morning, and in a sense we crawl up in a little ball and hear that we're loved, and we carry the burdens together. One of my friends said we can learn from Jesus, that even Jesus didn't carry his cross on his own. Referring to the fact that there was another fellow, Simon, that helped him carry his cross. And so the good news is that you're not alone, that you don't have to carry the burdens of the world on your own. And it's good news to the poor that maybe have a whole lot more burdens than they're meant to carry on their own, that you've got people that'll walk with you in that. If you're in domestic violence, there's other folks that will carry that with you and help you get out of that. And that's the gift of community. Many hands make for light work, and I guess many shoulders make the cross a little bit more bearable.
I want to turn to questions, but I'm struck that in your book you tell the story about the Christian journey, and for many people the way that we come about faith is that our lives we experience difficulty, and then we find Jesus, and Jesus sorts things out for us. And yet you say that your life was perfectly fine before you met Jesus, and he wrecked it. Yes? Yeah. And yet it has been an irresistible revolution. And I think I want you to comment on that, but I think for me it's so exciting to sit next to you, and I think it all just sense the energy, because I think that for a lot of us, we look at the world with the challenges, and we think about the steep climb that we might have to engage in to deal with some sort of issue in our world, and it's burdensome, but yet you're saying to us this Christian life is the most exciting thing that you can possibly engage in.
Well, I was, in some ways, I was in East Tennessee. I was always the really sweet kid. You know, I was like on all the student councils, and I got, the friendliest superlative and all those things, and I was prom king. It was a small town, but and then I mean it's true. I started reading the words of Jesus, and I really did feel my world spin upside down, and I began to think, would Jesus be hanging out with all the cool kids? Jesus, I read all of these things that it was like if you want to be the greatest and become the least, and I'm trying to think why am I working so hard to be the coolest and the greatest and make the most money and all this stuff? So there was sort of that collision. I love how someone once said, it's not the parts of the Bible that I don't understand that disturb me, it's the parts of the Bible I do understand that disturb me, but I guess that's why you go to seminary and you hear it all explained away, But there really does come a moment where you very simply come back and you say, what if Jesus really meant this? That's what we've really been after. And Mother Teresa said, following Jesus is simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. In fact, quite to the contrary, I think that to love our neighbor as ourselves is maybe the most incredible command we can ever think of when we understand that, we have neighbors that are dying because they don't have a mosquito net that costs $3 and it would prevent malaria. We have neighbors that don't have clean water, and so what does it mean to love our neighbor? Or we've got neighbors right here in Charlotte that don't have homes, and so we've got extra room in our homes, and what does that look like? And I'm not a big fan of guilt, though. I'll be honest. I think that guilt can sometimes be a good indicator, but it's a terrible motivator. And by that I mean sometimes you feel guilt, and that's actually showing us that something might not be where it could be, but we can't be driven out of guilt. We've got to be driven out of love. And the people that I see that have given their lives for Jesus and the gospel and recklessly given away their possessions and things like that, they're the most alive people I've ever seen. At one point, a journalist said to Mother Teresa, I couldn't do what you do if you paid me $1 million. And she said, I wouldn't do it for $1 million either, but I do it because it's what I'm made for. And that's, I think, the real secret is that as we give our lives away, we find our life.
Last question. We're in a process of thinking about leaps of faith. All of us, we're thinking about what does it mean for us to take an individual leap of faith? And then what does it mean for us as a church to take a sort of a corporate leap of faith to have a deeper impact in the life of our city and our world? And as we think about that, what would you encourage us to think about as far as a leap of faith? What might a leap of faith be?
One of my friends that lives in Latin America said part of the reason that you all in the industrialized countries, you don't see many miracles anymore is because you don't really need miracles. If you get sick, you go to the hospital. If you get hungry, you go to the grocery store, and this guy said, where we are in our little village, we actually live off of miracles and providence that you sometimes can't explain. In fact, he told me this really cool story about how they have a medical clinic, but they don't always have medicine. And so he said one day all that they had was a little bottle of Pepto-Bismol. And he's like, it's all that we had. So we just prayed over it, and we said, God, this is all we have. Help us. And he said, so folks started coming to the clinic, and they got a spoonful of Pepto. It didn't matter if they had like a gash in their arm or a bad back. They got Pepto and a prayer. And he said, but people were getting healed, and folks' word started spreading. There was a line all the way outside of the village, about this. This isn't a Pepto commercial, but I think it's like I think that those things happen, and we have to put ourselves in a place where we do rely on God, and that's an incredible thing that I think we're still exploring. But I can say that the moments in my life where I felt like things were totally impossible, and that I'm totally outside of any comfort or any security or assurance, have been some of the most powerful moments of my life. Unfortunately, they're not as common as I might want them to be, but just a few years ago, I was in Iraq. I've been able to go over a couple of times, and to accompany friends and folks in Iraq during the war and everything there. And probably one of the most powerful, mystical moments of my life was the night before the bombing in Baghdad. I was in Baghdad with a group of Christian peacemakers, and we were praying that night. And it was the strangest thing that the wind just started whipping outside, and it was picking up all of this red dirt from the desert. And then it started raining, which didn't happen a whole lot in Baghdad at the time. And so it started raining. And as the rain was falling, it was picking up the red dirt, and it was dripping on our shirts, and it literally looked like the heavens were bleeding. And it was in those moments that I've felt so close to God, because you have no idea what's going to happen next, and I think that's part of how Mother Teresa and so many other folks, that they began to live in that liminal space where every moment was dependent on God, and Mother, that's why she had such courage, I think, because she had nothing to lose. I can remember Mother Teresa in the middle of a bombing. She said, "We're going in." Said, you can't go in and get the kids. I mean, this is an active war zone. And she says, "Oh, we'll pray all night first for a ceasefire, and we'll go in tomorrow." And there was a ceasefire, and she went in. But I think that risk may look different than the risks that you all are making, here in Charlotte. But I think what we're shooting for is that we get into a space where we really do begin to rely on God, not on our 401k or our, whatever it is that we're putting our hope in for tomorrow. And I think the more people that you have that you're doing it with, the more reckless and the more exciting and vigorous it is, and the more of God that we can experience and see, because that's what faith is, right? Is believing not in what we see, but in what we can't see. And the last image that comes to my mind is that miracle feeding of the thousands, the fish and the loaves story. And it's very interesting if you read this story. What happens is that Jesus has been teaching. You may be familiar with it. There's all these thousands of hungry people, and the disciples come up to Jesus and they say, "Jesus, there's all these hungry people. Do something." And Jesus' response is awesome. He looks at them and he goes, "You do something. Feed them." And they start thinking, how are we going to do that? That's thousands of dollars, and where's the nearest Papa John's? How are we actually going to feed all these people? And Jesus says, "What do you got?" And they've got a few fish and loaves, from a little kid's lunch. And Jesus takes it and adds a little God stuff, and suddenly everyone eats, and there's baskets left over. And what I love about that story is that little kid got to be a part of the miracle, and the disciples were invited to be a part of the conspiracy, that Jesus didn't just turn stones into bread, but invites us to be a part of this healing of the land, of the bringing of the kingdom. And I think that is what an amazing thing, that for some strange reason, God doesn't want to change the world without us. But it takes us, I think, realizing that God wants our hands, and God's not limited to our hands, but God wants the broken pieces that we have to be a part of this wonderful conspiracy of healing and restoration.
We can become an answer to people's prayers.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I think the disciples saw, is that we could sit around and pray for this, but Jesus is shooting that back. I mean, it happens all the time, doesn't it? That we throw our hands up at God and we say, "God, why don't you do something about the fact that 20,000 people will starve to death today?" And if we listen really closely, I think we can hear God say back, "I did do something. I made you." And that is what it means to be the body of Christ. That Christ has no other hands but ours, no other feet but ours. We are to be an extension of that love today in our world.
All right. Thank you, John.
Let's take a few questions.
I think I'm still having technical difficulties or not? Is that okay? Okay, we're cool. Thanks.
Catherine said, "Oh Lord." You have mentioned the term "we" a lot. Who are we? Is that a movement that you've got? I mean, a group that you've got with you, or is that just a sort of a terminology that you use?
You know, that's a really interesting question, because I think I'm continually training my mind, I guess, to think in terms of we, you know, in the sense of that we're in a community in Philly, so we have about a dozen of us that are living and working every day together in Philly. And now there's, a growing movement of communities that we've got a website called Community of Communities. And there's hundreds of communities around the country and the world of young folks and older folks that are trying to discover what it means to be the church and to live together. And it doesn't all mean in, row houses in the inner city, but there's a lot of really beautiful expressions of community. So most of the time when I'm saying we, I'm talking about our little group of subversive friends in North Philadelphia. But there's certainly, I think, congregations like you all are a part of that we. I think that the prayer of Jesus was that we would be one as God's one. So the more that we can see ways to overlap are we, with the community here, we're excited to do that. So, thanks.
I want to call on my colleague John for a second, because John had a question he asked me earlier that I thought was very powerful, and I want him to ask you this, Shane.
I heard that you have some relationship with the Mennonites. Is that correct?
I like the Mennonites, yeah.
I think I like them too, but I don't know that much about them. And the reason I think I like them is I heard that the Mennonites choose to focus at least as much on, if maybe not more than, the foot washing over the Eucharist. That when we get to that Maundy, Thursday night, the new commandment that Christ gives us is to love one another as He's loved us. And we Episcopalians weekly remember the Eucharist. But Raymond Brown, in a book he wrote, a little fictional book he wrote, asked the question, what would the world look like, how would the world be different if we had chosen to focus more on the foot washing than on the Eucharist, which happened the same night, same time, same dinner, but we picked one and not the other, maybe.
Yeah. It's wonderful. And they do, a lot of the Mennonites, even Orthodox, some others have like a sacrament or a practice of foot washing. And I think that's exactly what I think all of us need to be doing is pulling out the best of the different traditions and what they have to bring us, and as we seek that one as God is one. Like, I want some of the fire of the Pentecostals. I want the foot washing of the Mennonites. I want the liturgy of the Episcopalians. We need some of these things that we learn from each other. But incidentally, I think when it comes to Christian practice, the Mennonites understand community. They understand nonviolence and radical economics in ways that are just astounding. Of course, the Amish would be like Mennonite on steroids, but like you think about the Amish, and certainly there's plenty of things that we could critique about the Amish, but the fact is one of the things that you see is that this is a Christianity you can see. You can see what it means to be countercultural. As Romans says, not to conform to the patterns of the world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, to have a new imagination. And so I've spent as much time as I can with Mennonites and Amish folks. And you can almost, there was one event that I was at where I was picked up in an Amish carriage and driven 30 miles to my speaking event. And it took a while to get there. And as I'm in that, I'm listening to them talk about their life, and you think how relevant it is to our world, that they're not too worried about the price of gas, and they're going to survive the recession. They know how to can food and build barns, and in light of that, maybe it's not so weird to understand why they responded to the school shooting the way they did, right? About 5 years ago, 2 hours from where we live, a man came in and killed a bunch of the Amish kids. But if you've tracked that story, what happened was the Amish served that family of the shooter. The first thing they did was go to him, and go to his family, and he killed himself, of course. And they went to his family and they said, "Can we do anything for you?" They began to get money, and they took the money to create scholarships for the children of the shooter. And when the funeral rolled around, they went to the funeral of their own kids, but then they went to the funeral of the shooter. I mean, that's the foot washing in practice, you know, and like it caught the whole world's attention. I was in Australia and speaking when that happened, and what made headline news in Australia was Amazing Grace. Why would they do what they did? And it told not just the story of the horror of that incident, but of the compassion of the Amish after the incident. And so we wrote a little book called Jesus for President, but we have a section called Amish for Homeland Security. Because you just think like that, how beautiful is the way that they responded to terror, you know? And I think like more and more that kind of Christian practice, I mean, it doesn't make sense to the pattern of the world. You know, as Corinthians says, like, the cross is foolishness. It's like to the wisdom of this world or the smarts of smart bombs. But it is that which I think we need to rediscover, and the Mennonites have much to teach us.
One more question or so here? Yes, sir.
Shane, you'd mentioned about reading the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And what it means, I'd like to hear what you think of like the Occupy Wall Street movement and those kind of things and how it relates.
Great. I think we're out of time, right, Chip?
Yeah, I think we are.
I actually, I'm really excited by the question because I think that one of the things that we really need to be able to talk about are the real stuff of the world that we live in. I mean, Jesus, when he's telling parables, he's not just talking about pie in the sky theology. He's talking about wages and day laborers and widows and orphans and unjust judges. I mean, he's talking about the real stuff of his world as he's telling his stories. And so, I think that the Occupy movement, it may not have all the answers, but it's raising a lot of good questions, questions that I think Jesus was raising about inequities in the world. And the fact is that, you know, 1% of the world does own over 40% of the world's stuff. And what does that mean? When the average North American is consuming the same amount as 500 Africans, you know, what does it mean to love our neighbor as ourselves? And so I think we should engage those questions. And I don't think that means we need that everybody's got to endorse Occupy Wall Street, but I think all of us should engage the Occupy movement. We should wrestle with the questions that it's raising. And I also think that it will continue to raise those questions as long as it remains humble and nonviolent. And anywhere we are, we can become pretentious and polarizing, you know. And so I would say that part of Christian justice is that it's restorative, and it's looking to God loves not just the 99%, but the 100%, you know. And the fact is that some of the rich folks are suffering from the patterns also. I mean, in the richest corners of the world, we have the highest rates of loneliness, depression, and suicide, you know. So I think that, like, God may have a different dream than Wall Street, and we should ask questions about, you know, when CEOs are making 400 times their workers, what does that look like in light of God's kingdom? So I'm excited by that, but I also think we have to be careful not to just polarize people. And there's something that we can learn from both conservatives and liberals, and that's that you can have a lot of great arguments and still be mean. And the real question is not just about being right, but about being nice. And Jesus' table, Jesus' banquet table, we have to remember, had room for a tax collector and a zealot. And those folks didn't eat dinner together much. You know, in fact, like zealots killed tax collectors for fun on weekends. You know, and so in some ways it might be like having a Wall Street banker with an Occupy movement person, you know. But Jesus is going to challenge the patterns of the tax collecting system. And Jesus is going to challenge the sword of the zealots and invite all of us to become a new creation. And I think that's the invitation of Jesus. And as Desmond Tutu says, the revolution of God is big enough to set both the oppressed and the oppressors free. And that's what I really think we should be longing for, is a world where everyone has enough. That proverb says, give me neither riches nor poverty, for in my poverty I could be forced to steal, or in my riches I would forget my God. But let us pray that we would have enough for this day our daily bread. And that's the dream, I think, that we're shooting for. And so if Occupy or if anything else can raise the right questions for us, then thanks be to God.
Shane, thank you for inviting us to become new creations. I don't know what to say. We're about to be occupied by about 500 children in our hallways upstairs, and a service that's going to start here in a little bit. But may we all walk out of here today recognizing that being a Christian means that we too can become ordinary radicals. Radical in love and generosity and compassion, restoring our world, our neighborhood, our city to what it can be. May we walk out with the passion that Shane has, knowing that we too can work together as we to transform our world. Thank you, Shane, for such an incredible example.